America's hot topic, like non-citizens and voting rights. Who needs boring, straightforward elections when you can have a partisan showdown over local voting rights? Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, where we break down interesting legislation with a dash of wit and a splash of sass. I'm Sarah, your host, and with me as always is my legislative partner in crime, Stephen. Today, we have our first double header looking at non-citizen voting in the U.S. First, we're diving into H.R. 192, a bill aiming to prohibit non-U.S. citizens from voting in D.C. elections. Next week, we'll look at the SAVE Act, which wants to make sure only citizens vote in federal elections. Ready to get into it, Stephen?
Absolutely, Sarah.
So, H.R. 192 is designed to stop non-citizens from voting in local elections in D.C. We're talking about everything from the mayor to school boards, but non-citizens already can't vote in federal elections. Why this extra step?
Well, Sarah, the bill's proponents, like Congressman August Pfluger, argue that even non-citizen participation in local elections can undermine election integrity. They're worried about the potential influence on decisions affecting residents' everyday lives, especially given DC's unique position under federal oversight.
And speaking of Congressman Pfluger?
Pfluger. I looked it up. Pfluger.
Not a word I am used to pronouncing. He's been quite persistent with this bill, right? Like, it was first introduced in 2022, and he keeps reintroducing it. What is his kind of motive behind it?
Well, he claims that the bill was a reaction to the DC's city council move to let non-citizens vote in local elections after just 30 days of residency. Pfluger and his supporters see this as a threat to election integrity, especially given their concerns over undocumented immigrants potentially voting.
Interesting. But didn't the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act already pass after facing some heavy opposition?
Yes, it did. It was quite a controversial bit of legislation in the end, and it faced a lot of bipartisan pushback, but it still managed to pass in the end. So people may be aware of this, that DC Council gets to set its own laws. So in a certain way, it's sort of independent, more so certainly than other districts. But importantly, Congress has a veto power. So if Congress don't like anything that the DC Council does, they can introduce a bill, pass the bill through both houses, and then the president has to sign it. But they can then say, no, we're vetoing this. And it has happened in the past. We saw some obviously quite big issues. But this one, even though there was quite a lot of pushback, and they didn't quite manage to get to the point where they're actually vetoing it, even though they tried very hard. So it did actually pass. As soon as the bill passed, it was immediately challenged in court by 7 DC voters. Their assertion was that their votes would be diluted in some way if you allowed all of these non-citizens to vote as well. There's obviously be more people voting, their votes would count for less. Okay, it's a bit of an odd argument, really. And the challenge was eventually dismissed by the district court, and the court stated that citizens' votes wouldn't be devalued by non-citizen participation, and said that their challenge eventually wasn't valid.
You know, there's 2 really interesting pieces there that, one, I want to highlight to anybody listening today. If you do not know how the DC Council passes legislation, it is so fascinating. And I think I wrote a blog about it. Somebody else may have, but it's on Bill Track 50. Look it up. It is perplexing and interesting and such a convoluted way of passing stuff. Go look at that. But also, I find that argument so intriguing because I hear that a lot from people when we're talking about the Senate and how a person in Wyoming is worth, I can't remember what it is, but it's like 10,000 Californians or something like that. And this voting delusion.
Wyoming would probably agree with that.
Yes. And, you know, it is such an interesting kind of perplexing issue where, you know, how do we ensure that everybody is accurately represented? And, you know, as our world keeps changing and, you know, even the weird way that we do even our votes and our presidential election, and it's, you know, not by popular majority, but it's just so interesting. And I think that there's a lot of different conversations happening about what is equitable, what is right, and then it's weird when we start talking about it with things like this, because then there's always kind of an undertone of you don't belong here, you don't get to participate here. But if you belong to a community, it is nice to be able to participate in that community. And not everybody in communities is illegal or anything like that. Many people who are
Absolutely,
non-citizens are
absolutely.
legally here. So,
It does sort of lead you on naturally to the arguments as well. Well, should DC actually be a state in that case? Or should it just be part of another state? Why on earth does it have this strange status? And then, of course, you've got all the other territories as well. What about Puerto Rico? What about Guam? There are sort of other states out there that aren't fully represented either, and perhaps they should be states too.
yes, no, I'm with you. But back to the bill at hand. So,
Yes.
HR 192 is essentially a reaction to that district court ruling. How has the bill fared so far in Congress?
Well, it had a new burst of life following the dismissal of the court case in DC, and it passed the House with a significant majority. Actually, it was 262 votes to 143, so it had quite some considerable bipartisan support here. So it's not a purely partisan issue. There's a lot of people who feel that it's sort of the sort of fundamental principle that you have to be a citizen to vote should be protected under all circumstances, really. But of course, now it's crossed over and it's in the Senate, and its fate there is far less certain, really. You obviously have the Democratic majority there, and then the president would be likely to veto it if it ever went through anyway, as well.
This bill seems to have really reignited a debate over non citizen voting rights. Can you give us a bit of background on the current state of non citizen voting?
Yes, so the really important thing to state up front is that currently federal law strictly prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections. So we're talking about Congress, president, and so on. And there are severe penalties for violations. And we'll discuss this in more detail next week, but it's basically hefty fines, big prison sentences, and obviously if you're an immigrant and you're voting, then you'll be deported, right? So they'll sort of kick you out of the country as well. So it is strictly prohibited. However, when we come down to local elections, it's a little bit more mixed. Now, historically, of course, non-citizens could vote. Many states between 1776 and 1924 actually allowed non-citizen voting. And then gradually after that, as sort of concerns about immigration started to increase, as America moved from this country saying, yeah, send us everybody, to yeah, maybe we don't want everybody, then states began passing these laws. And so now there's only a few municipalities in California, in Maryland, and Vermont, as well as obviously DC, that allow limited voting in local elections only. So again, these local elections, local councils and that kind of thing.
Really interesting. And proponents argue that this type of movement is about protecting our elections from the potential influence of non citizens, especially in light of all of the immigration concerns we've been hearing about kind of ad nauseum here in the States, especially in the last 6 months. But what are kind of the main points here?
Well, yeah, so the immigration is obviously a key point here, that it's a really, really hot topic at the moment in the US, as everybody's well aware, really. This is really what's behind this bill. They claim that allowing non-citizens to vote, even locally, complicates voter registration and could confuse non-citizens about when they're allowed to vote. And so there is a parallel here with what happened in the EU, what happens in the EU right now, and what happened in the UK when we're part of the EU. But again, you just make sure that election documentation is very, very clear about who can vote and who can't vote, and you double check everything. So, there are certainly ways around that. They also argue it's a matter of national security, and it's about maintaining the integrity of Americans as well. So it's part of this general narrative that American elections are under threat, and that the rules and regulations around them need tightening up to make sure that only the right people are allowed to vote, and that you can be absolutely certain that the person who's voting is the person they claim they are. And of course, they really do talk about these undocumented migrants or illegal immigrants. Voting is the key factor, really, I think, that's driving this bill forward.
But there's opponents to this that say something completely different. What does the opposition to this say?
Well, the opposition have a very clear, simple argument, really. They say that this bill is a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, and that it is merely an attempt to undermine the faith in American elections, which we've sort of seen a lot of over the past few years. And there are even some people who go as far as comparing it to sort of racist attempts in the past to block certain ethnic groups from voting. So there have been various waves of this throughout American history. history where, as you get a certain wave of immigrants, they say, no, we don't want these people, and we certainly shouldn't allow them to vote. So they think it's an attempt to disenfranchise tax-paying residents who contribute to the community and therefore deserve to have a vote, deserve to have a voice in local governance. I mean, after all, didn't someone once say no taxation without representation? I recall a while back there was quite a kerfuffle about it.
Is that still a sore point with the
It's
election
all fun.
happening in the
Yeah,
UK on
yeah,
July
yeah.
4th? A really great day in the UK's
It was.
history.
It was a good day.
Maybe we should move on. Maybe we should move on.
Yes.
Um, so, HR 192 is essentially kind of caught in a tug of war, it seems, between election integrity and voting rights. Will it pass the Senate? I don't know about that. But one thing's for sure, this debate is not going anywhere.
Absolutely, absolutely. With elections obviously in the US just around the corner, I think we'll see this issue come up over and over again.
I agree. All right. Well, that is a wrap for today's episode of Beyond the Build Number. Thanks for tuning in, and remember to subscribe. Until next time.